All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. Iran. By now, as I'm recording this, the so-called 12 days war, as they're calling it, this, bombing, really an unprovoked bombing from Israel to Iran, and then bombing back and forth, people dying on both sides, unfortunately. And that's one important point before we go further. I don't stand with the U.S. government. I don't stand with the Israeli government or the Iranian government or the Iranian military or the Israeli military or the U.S. military or any of their NATO allies or China or Russia. I stand with the people of all these countries, because at the end of the day, the people are going to suffer. And that's what we're already seeing. So the egos of Trump and the leaders of Iran and Netanyahu battle each other out, and they decide to drop bombs, often based on lies, and real people suffer. That doesn't mean we're going to explore some of these theories, as many of you may believe, that there's actually coordination between Trump in Iran and Israel. And I have my skepticism. I asked this in a poll on social media the other day, whether or not people actually believe that those nations, the US, the UK, the Five Eyes nations, Israel on one side, and then Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, etc. If people truly believe that these are opposing forces, or if that's all a show and behind the scenes they all get along. I tend to think that there might be some real conflicts based on cultural differences and different kind of details. But at the end of the day, these people are going to align together and work together 99 times out of 100 before they work with you. They're going to align and work together before they work with you. So even if they don't agree on every single decision and the whole thing's not a complete, staged soap opera, they will still work together in the end. And the only reason people get taken out, like Gaddafi or Saddam, doesn't mean they're good people. But the main reason that the U.S. decides to act and their allies decide to act is if it benefits them, and not benefits American interest or freedom or democracy, but it benefits the oil companies or it benefits the pharma companies to get opium or other things like that, or geopolitical moves, things like that. So I'm hyper skeptical about everything that we're seeing playing out. So Israel bombs Iran and then bomb back and forth. And then just this past Saturday on the 21st, Trump bombs Iran in a huge step forward. I mean, this is unprecedented. I mean, you can go back and find articles on theconsciousresistance.com and videos I've done where we've talked about this and warned that there likely would be some type of false flag under the Trump administration, and that Trump was going to get pushed towards war with Iran. I know some of you take a kind of favorable approach of that and think, well, Trump is being tricked by the deep state. I don't. I believe this was part of the reason Trump was brought in the first place. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But let's go ahead and look at a couple of reports here. This is an NBC News report when we first got the news. As you see here, President Trump announces U.S. strike against Iranian nuclear sites. Now, there's on the Trump side, on the U.S. government side, they're claiming this was a complete obliteration of Iranian nuclear capabilities, because they've been telling us for decades now that Iran was weeks away or months away from being able to have nuclear capabilities, and that they could strike the U.S. or the U.S. allies and blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. It's been one of those long, propaganda pieces. And that's, again, not a defense of Iran or anything like that. But I've certainly been hearing that the whole 15 years that I've been doing activism journalism, that Iran was weeks away. And it just seems like a convenient propaganda tool when they want. Seems like another, weapons of mass destruction that we're being warned about and told to be afraid. Nevertheless, after Israel launched attacks at Iran unprovoked, and meanwhile in the background there have been these negotiations going on. In fact, this past Sunday, right before Trump bombed Iran, there was supposed to be continuations of peace talks, and of course Israel bombed them before they even made it to the next date for the peace talks, and then Trump bombed them too. And Trump was claiming that this is a complete obliteration of the nuclear sites, but now we're getting mixed reports. Here's one from MSNBC. We're going to look at a few different things. And again, I know some of you are going to say, Derrick, these are mainstream websites. Take it how you like. Well, we're looking at across the spectrum. We're not just looking at independent media claiming they have secret sources, but we are second guessing and looking deeper than what the mainstream is saying. But it's important to know what they're reporting. And also, as I've said on the show before, that's not really how false information works. It's not that the corporate media is completely fake all the time, 100%. It's that they mix truth with lies. And it's important to be able to decipher those things. So anyways, MSNBC says how Trump took advantage of Iran's face-saving retaliation strategy. Iran fired 14 short and medium-range ballistic missiles towards a U.S. base in Qatar, and this was at what they called the low end of the escalations ladder. So, as I said, Israel bombed Iran. The two of them start going at it. Trump bombs Iran on Saturday, claims it's a complete obliteration of all their nuclear capabilities, and then Iran says they're going to retaliate. But the interesting thing is they actually did notify the U.S. government ahead of time. And I started to look into this, if this is a normal thing. There are examples of militaries giving each other advance notice when, they're going to attack for various reasons. It's kind of weird. It's weird to all of us to even give your enemy a courtesy of like, hey, by the way, we're about to launch a bomb on one of your bases, just in case you want to get some people out of there. Go ahead and do that. And we're going to blow it up in, a couple hours. That's kind of what it looks like happened with Iran retaliating to Trump's bombing. They notified the Trump administration and told them that they were going to be launching some missiles at this Al Udeid air base in Qatar. And it was supposed to be this, at the end of the day, this is a symbolic action. And this opinion piece calls it a highly choreographed nature of the attack, which came only after Iran gave Qatar a heads up about when the attack would occur and where it would send the missiles, and can it only be described as a concerted effort to attempt to limit the damage to the absolute minimum. Trump acknowledged this on Truth Social, writing, I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody was injured. And I found that in the past, Trump has kind of talked about this whenever he, in his first administration, when he violated international law and assassinated Soleimani, which was also a whole nother constitutional controversial thing. He did interviews after that and said that in retaliation to that, the Iranians launched some missiles, but they let the U.S. know ahead of time. So that's kind of weird. And some people see that and they're like, okay, this is all just a stage show. They're literally just telling each other when they're going to bomb each other. And I don't know, that could be proof of it being staged or some, kind of coordination. It also does appear, as I said, that sometimes there have been historical examples where they do warn each other. Now, as far as the claim that Trump had destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities, this is what I'm finding now as of tonight. The 24th, Reuters, U.S. airstrikes failed to destroy Iran's nuclear sites, sources say. Now, of course, we should be skeptical always of just anonymous random sources, but I think Reuters is less sensational than a lot of the cable news networks, and I will not be surprised if this is just the first confirmation of more to come. It says, 3 sources familiar with the matter who spoke on condition of anonymity told Reuters of a preliminary assessment that says the U.S. airstrikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear capability and only set it back by a few months, according to a U.S. intelligence assessment, which is an initial intelligence assessment, which I won't be surprised if later Trump intervenes or they claim later, well, that was just the initial assessment. We later realized, no, he did destroy everything. And then we're going to have just conflicting narratives. One of the sources said Iran's enriched uranium stocks had not been eliminated, and in fact, the country's nuclear program may have been only set back a month or two. The assessment contradicted Trump's assertion this weekend that strikes had succeeded in destroying Tehran's nuclear program and raised questions about further U.S. military actions if indeed the program survived the intense aerial bombardment. The White House says the report was flat out wrong. The Trump administration told the UN Security Council on Tuesday that its weekend strikes had, quote, degraded Iran's nuclear program, short of what Trump had said earlier about it being obliterated. And Netanyahu, a prime minister of Israel, said that on Tuesday that the 12 days war of Iran had removed the threat of nuclear annihilation and was determined to thwart any attempt by Tehran to revive its program. So they're still threatening them. They're still saying this. But the first intelligence report is claiming that they only set it back maybe weeks, maybe months. Trump saying this is flat out wrong and that they degraded the program or they obliterated it. I think one theory here, because of course some people will jump and be like, haha, Trump and his stupid thing. He not only violated the Constitution, he didn't even succeed at what he claimed to do. They are, of course, claiming there's a ceasefire right now. But how long is that going to last? I don't know. And like I said, is this really all theater? These are questions we need to ask. But one way to think about this is that maybe there's an initial strike. Trump gets to claim like he did something great, but then later intelligence shows we actually didn't succeed. So we need more bombs. We need to actually fully go to war with Iran, or we need troops on the ground or something like this. So this so-called mistake could just be setting the stage for further action. And you see this also being reported now on CNN. Exclusive U.S. strikes on Iran did not destroy nuclear sites, sources say. And then we got another one here. This is the New York Times. Now let's switch for a moment before we get to some of the propaganda about sleeper cells, that they're saying that there's going to be Iranian sleeper cells that are going to pop up everywhere. Again, the fear porn is back in full bloom. But let's talk for a moment about the constitutionality of what Trump has done here. And I want to pull up two articles, one from the New York Times and one just from NBC News. Some lawmakers in both parties question the legality of Trump's Iran strikes. Was Trump's Iran attack illegal? Presidential war powers explained. And okay, let's start with the New York Times here. Again, the question here for a moment we're considering is whether or not this was illegal, constitutional, etc. I'm arguing that it's not, because and I will say again, I'm not even like a hardcore constitutionalist, but for people who claim to be conservative and claim to be, make America great again, make, America first, they sure seem to throw out the Constitution whenever it's not convenient for them. And I thought that's something they cared a lot about. So that's why we're considering this. Bombing Iran without congressional authorization escalated a bipartisan trend of presidents bypassing the original intent of the Constitution. Right there. No, Trump's not the first person to bomb another country without a declaration of war. Obama did it. Bush did it. We had the authorization of military force post 9/11. Of course, that's one thing, but that wasn't supposed to be a permanent state of emergency where you could just bomb any country forever into the future. That's the problem here, is that this should be reauthorized, and that Congress should have, our quote unquote representatives should have to come and approve of this. And there have been people over the years, including Ron Paul and now more recently Thomas Massie, who try to bring up the War Powers Act and get Congress to actually vote on this, or to try to impeach a president for intervening in other nations. Because we know Obama bombed Libya. He's dropping bombs in Somalia. So was Trump. We had bombing, of course, in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yemen, U.S. funding, military operations in Yemen through Saudi Arabia, as well as, of course, against the Palestinian people by funding Israel. I think these are all acts of war. Even if the U.S. isn't putting boots on the ground in every case, is if we're dropping bombs, if we're supplying weapons of war, I think that's still, that's part of the same thing in my mind. So let's get into this. This is from Charlie Savage at the New York Times. President Trump's decision to bomb 3 nuclear sites in Iran has prompted accusations that he violated the Constitution by carrying out an act of war without congressional authorization. The dispute underscores a split between the apparent intent of the Constitution and how the country has been governed in practice. While most legal scholars agree that the founders wanted Congress to decide whether to go to war unless the country is under attack, presidents in the modern era have carried out military strikes without authorization from lawmakers. Courts have shied away from weighing in, and Congress has acquiesced rather than impeaching those presidents. Jack Goldsmith, Harvard law professor, says, was the Iran strike constitutional? I don't know, because the constitutional law of war powers is inscrutable. Here's a closer look. They talk about what happened. It says critics are accusing Trump of violating the Constitution. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat, said on Fox News, it's unconstitutional for a president to initiate a war like this without Congress. I bet he didn't say anything during Obama's years. Republicans have not been silent as well. Thomas Massie wrote on social media, this is not constitutional. And of course, Trump is going to war and attacking Thomas Massie, even though I don't think he's perfect, and I know he's got some shady fundings, like people like 7Cs have looked at some connections. Even though he's not technically funded by AIPAC, there might be some indirect funding. He's still right about this. What does the Constitution say? The Constitution says the Congress has the power to declare war while it makes the president commander-in-chief of the military. Most legal scholars agree that the founders intended to separate the power to initiate a war from the power to run a war once it has begun, leaving the president able only to repel sudden attacks without first going to Congress. So most legal scholars agree that the founders wanted there to be a separate power to initiate war from a separate power to run a war once it has begun. And the president only has the ability to act without Congress to repel like sudden invasive attacks, not to launch ongoing attacks. In the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton wrote that the American president, while commander-in-chief of the armed forces, would have less power than the British king, since a president could not declare war by his own authority like a monarchy could. The Constitution also makes ratified treaties the supreme law of the land. The United Nations Charter, a treaty that the Senate ratified after World War II, says that except in self-defense, a country may only attack another country if the UN Security Council has authorized it. And I'm not saying we should follow the UN, but just another example of how the US signs things and doesn't even follow them. But in practice, since the end of World War II, the U.S. has maintained a large standing army, and they have rarely gotten congressional approval. Presidents since the end of the Cold War have obtained congressional authorizations for major land wars like the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But again, even those are sketchy circumstances because of the AUMF, the authorization of the use of military force post 9/11, which was just kind of rubber stamped every time. But presidents have also asserted a right to carry out so-called limited interventions, airstrikes, without going to going to Congress for congressional approval. So the article goes on from there. I will include this in the notes. I think, again, I'm not asking you to trust the New York Times alone, but this is a good summation of the legal issues at hand. We'll just read one more part. Is attacking Iran war in the constitutional sense? Some people who agree that the Constitution sometimes lets presidents carry out limited strikes without going to Congress have argued that bombing Iran's nuclear sites is different. Attacking Iran, they say, would be much more dangerous, carrying too much risk of escalation into a major armed conflict for one person to decide. So I guess they're saying because they're attacking alleged nuclear sites, it's fine. But if they were to attack something else, then that's too much risk of escalation. So it says in the Times Executive Power Survey during the 2020 cycle, Biden defended the executive branch's general view that presidents can, on their own, authorize strikes that are short of war in the constitutional sense. He suggested that prior to congressional permission, it would be constitutional and necessary to bomb Iran. This is what Biden said in 2020. Any initiation of the use of force against Iran or North Korea, unless in response to an imminent attack, which there was no sign of an imminent attack, definitely against the U.S., could certainly result in a wide-scale conflict and constitute a war in the constitutional sense that would require authorization by Congress. And then, of course, there's the War Powers Resolution, which was at the end of the Vietnam War. Congress tried to reclaim some of its eroding authority by enacting the War Powers Resolution, overriding a veto by President Richard Nixon. It says a president may only introduce forces into hostilities with congressional authorization or if the U.S. has been attacked. But as I said, this has also been, kind of overridden, like they say here. It also requires presidents to terminate deployments after 60 days if they lack authorization, which would suggest that one-off strikes and brief operations are allowed. Presidents of both parties have acted beyond the statute's purported constraints about when they may launch an attack, seeing it as unconstitutionally narrow. So they pretty much just do whatever the hell they want in the end. The courts aren't going to stop them, and Congress isn't stopping them, and voting ain't stopping them. And then one more, we won't read the whole thing. Some lawmakers in both parties question the legality of Trump's Iran strikes. I will include this one as well. But like I said, there's Thomas Massie, there's others who are, Ro Khanna is also, I think Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie introduced a resolution to try to get them to vote on the War Powers Act. I don't think that's going to happen, but people are trying to speak against this. And then one other opinion is coming from the 10th Amendment Center, which I'm trying to get an interview with the 10th Amendment Center soon. My friend Michael Bolden is one of the founders, if not the founder, and they've been at this since the 2010s. One of the true good independent organizations out there trying to help you understand the law and the way government is supposed to work, the way the U.S. government was supposed to work, at least in this idealized world, which I don't think is realistic and will ever happen. But they at least try to show you how the states are supposed to act in these circumstances. So let's take a look at this thread that they put together. This is actually from March, but just because it's relevant still. Thread, the declare war lie. Almost everything you've been taught about the Constitution and war powers is pure propaganda, and they have a video. But the thread says the executive has no right, this is a quote from James Madison, the executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. When he said in any case, he meant it. No exceptions, no loopholes. Yet today, politicians and so-called experts tell you otherwise. Just call it something other than a war, and Congress isn't needed. The Constitution is crystal clear. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. Congress shall have the power to declare war, not the president, not the judiciary. The founders intentionally gave this power to Congress. Thomas Jefferson said, Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. James Wilson wrote, it will not be in the power of a single man to involve us in war. The founders designed the system to prevent unilateral war making. Even Alexander Hamilton, who supported a strong executive, agreed, writing, quote, the legislature alone can declare war, can alone actually transfer the nation from peace to hostility. When Hamilton sounds like a small government guy in comparison to almost everyone today, you know things are way off the rails. He also said, James Madison called this the wisest part of the Constitution, quote, and no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature. Why did the founders do this? They fought a war to secede from an empire where one made that decision. They knew an executive with unchecked war powers equals tyranny. And this thread goes on. I will include the entire thread for everybody who wants to follow that. And then just to show you kind of even more relevant today, DC Drano, who is a total, freaking America first psyop. Never forget, Thomas Massie tried to stop President Trump from destroying Iran's nukes and negotiating a peace deal between Iran and Israel. And as people are calling him out, Iran never had nukes. They weren't close to enriching uranium. Ceasefire is not a peace deal. But the 10th Amendment Center did call this out and said, the only people who say an airstrike isn't war are the people who have been so damaged by government-run education that they know nothing from the founders or how they defined war. So I think that's really where it stands. I think it is absolutely an unconstitutional act. And it's something that, if there was ever actually a government that give a damn about that, or if the people were able and capable of holding the politicians accountable, or if the courts were, you would see impeachments, not just with Trump, but it would have happened with Biden. It would have happened with Obama, and it definitely would have happened. Maybe Bush could have got away with it because, post 9/11, he did get some authorization. Now it went way beyond 60 days and it just dragged on and dragged on. Of course, Obama came in and promised to change that. We all know how that turned out, but definitely Obama, definitely Trump, definitely Biden should have been impeached on the unconstitutional war actions alone. The final section of this story, guys, relates to this claims of sleeper cells and of the general propaganda that is popping up now that Iran might respond to the U.S. attacking them with cyber attacks or sleeper cells. Like I told you already, they already bombed a U.S. Army military base in Qatar, and they warned the U.S. ahead of time. And one building got blown up from what I saw. I think the reports I read said that all the missiles that got launched, the U.S. blocked them except for one, and then it blew up a little piece of the base. And so they can say, hey, look, we're under threat. And Iran can say, hey, we stuck it to them. They both get to feed garbage to their people. But now they're saying there could be cyber attacks, there could be sleeper cells, there could be, all kinds of things. And they want people to be living in a state of fear again and all hyped up and paranoid. And I want to warn against this. But I also, let me go ahead and pop this back on screen. I do want to explore this claim for a moment. Trump administration boosts monitoring of possible Iran-linked cells in U.S. as Trump weighs strikes, sources say. This is before Trump bombed, so 2 days before. But they were already kind of seeding that out there that Iran might be, coming after the U.S. and sleeper cells, and then Trump bombs them, and now there's still propaganda about that. Now, here's one from MSNBC from just June 23rd, yesterday, so a couple days after Trump bombed, General Wesley Clark. There are Iranian sleeper cells in the U.S. that could self-activate in retaliation. It says, Iran is vowing a retaliation after the U.S. struck its nuclear facilities over the weekend. NBC News talks to former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired General Wesley Clark, for his insight and expertise. And so he says, Iran could self-activate. You guys might remember Wesley Clark, retired United States Army officer and general, obviously. And he was most well known because, as this WikiLeaks tweet recently reminded us, former general of the U.S. Army Wesley Clark, after the 9/11 attacks, he said this to Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, that there was a plan that the U.S. was going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. This was in 2007. Now, obviously, it's taken longer than 5 years, but Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing it off with Iran. That was his words. And guess what? They tweeted this out August 2024. So it's interesting. Here's another article from that time from Al Jazeera. This was 2003. U.S. plans to attack 7 Muslim states. Presidential hopeful General Wesley Clark says the White House devised a 5-year plan after 9/11 strikes to attack 7 majority Muslim countries. So you can see that this was being discussed. It's kind of weird now that Wesley Clark, who was warning that there was a plan to do that, is now on MSNBC essentially selling propaganda about Iranian sleeper cells, that it's like he's kind of selling the narrative to justify why the U.S. should go further. Maybe he could be telling the truth. Maybe he doesn't realize that he's selling propaganda. Maybe he doesn't realize the role he's playing, especially when he was the one who warned about it. I don't know. I just find it really crazy that years ago, this guy's warning there's a plan to invade all these countries, finishing off with Iran. And now here he is in 2025 on MSNBC selling some sleeper cells propaganda. In fact, if anybody's going to have sleeper cells, I would guess it would be the CIA or the Mossad. And I will take you back to this report that some of you saw. It had 1.7 million views on, when did this come out? It was in December 2024. How Israel's Mossad tricked Hezbollah into buying explosive pagers. This is remember after the pager bombs were going off and Hezbollah, the Hezbollah agents, the so-called terrorists who are wearing these pagers, they got blown up in Lebanon. And this they interview an undercover kind of anonymous Israeli agent who describes how they make it happen. I mean, there's some pretty crazy stuff in there. He talks about how we create the reality, you're just living in it. But this to me is just a reminder that if anybody's got the capability for sleeper cells, for attacks like this, it would be the Mossad, it would be the CIA. I don't think Iran has the capability to do this in the U.S. I know there's this narrative that a lot of the right-wing media is buying into. Well, it was because of Biden and his freaking immigration policy, and it let in some Iranian sleeper cells, or was it Chinese sleeper cells? I remember this. They were saying this last year. No, they're letting in the Chinese. No, they're letting in the Iranians. No, they're letting in. And I guess they could be letting them all in, right? But it just seems to be so convenient to keep people in that left-right paradigm of, well, the other side did this, so now Trump has to fix it, and we're going to have to clamp down. We're going to have cameras everywhere. I guarantee you the technocracy is going to advance as part of this propaganda. That's for certain, and that's something we can definitely count on. The other thing I want to say about this is that Israel has a history of these sort of things, of false flag attacks, of terror attacks, and staging them. And we should not put it past them. And I've been warning people about that on social media as well. If you're told that there's some kind of terror attack that happens in the next week or anytime in the coming days, I would be very, very skeptical of that. I would definitely not just blindly take that story and swallow it up. I encourage you to use your critical thinking, to not allow these people to push you towards fear, to push you towards being in a state of imbalance. Again, I'm not saying that there's no war. There's no potential for any of that to happen. There absolutely could be. Although, as I said earlier, I tend to think these people are kind of all on the same sides, at least to some degree. But don't let yourself be pushed into fear. That's what the predator class would love. That's how they can manipulate us. That's how they can control us if we're not in a state of balance and focus and taking care of our hearts, our minds, our bodies, etc. So,
since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.